Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you tonight. My name is Barbara Grosh, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters here in the Rochester metropolitan area. The League is a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse candidates or parties. We do work to make an informed electorate who's ready to cast their ballots in meaningful ways. So tonight's webinar, we have some guests from the Rochester City Wide Tenants Union. And let me just share their statement. The City Wide Tenants Union is a grassroots organization which helps tenants advocate for changes in the system. The organization is built out of the needs of tenants. We believe in order to change the system, those who have been impacted have a voice in building solutions. We would like to break through the stereotypes and see people as community. All right, so I am going to introduce Liz McGriff, who's going to start us off. We'll have 3 speakers from the Tenants Union tonight. Liz first, and I think then Liesl Coleman is next, and then Ryan Acuff will give us some input, and I've forgotten the name of the last person you told me. Liz, I invite you to unmute and tell us about the possibilities for rent stabilization in Rochester.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to present to your organization. Our expectation is that you'll get a clear understanding of what rent stabilization is, and that you'll be so moved to sign on to our letter of support and join us in a coalition space to build better things for our community as a whole. So I'll start off with talking about rent stabilization. What rent stabilization is it's for buildings that are not regulated, like Section 8 is regulated through HUD, and there are other buildings that have like regulations on them. So these are the unregulated buildings in the community, and I know a lot of people have seen the rents increase in our community, and it's caused a lot of hardship. So what rent stabilization is something that we had, years ago. We had rent control in 1943 to 1961. And in 1961, the governor, who was a Republican governor, took it away. Can you hear? Okay. Took it away, but it remained in some of the outskirts towns like Irondequoit, Brighton, and Greece until 1973. In 2019, we lobbied to get rent stabilization back in our community, and we were able to win it in 2019, which gave us the opportunity to opt into that program. So we won it in 2019, and it was in New York City, but it was expanded at that time into municipalities, which gave us the opportunity to opt in. So this is an opportunity for us to bring rent control back into our community. And so I want to pass it to Liesl to give information about the problem. Oh, and I forgot to mention as well, rent stabilization is for buildings built before 1974 that have 6 or more units. And it also gives us an opportunity to have a rent guidelines board to regulate how the rents are in our community, so they don't go too high, so people can't afford to remain in their community.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, as Liz was saying, so in 2019, we spread this law to all of upstate. And we were able to opt in as a municipality. And in the December of 2019, actually, the City of Rochester City Council unanimously passed a vacancy study, which is the first step to opting into rent stabilization in the City of Rochester. That vacancy study was conducted, but it was there were lots of issues with the methodology. So we're back here in 2024 asking for a new vacancy study to start that process. And Liz gave you some of the history of the bill that puts into context why we need to bring this back. This is a racial justice issue that hopes to help some of the harms that were done by redlining. And when it was taken away in 1961, this was due to a large migration of Black folks up from the South to escape the conditions of Jim Crow. So bringing rent control back to the city of Rochester really is a racial justice issue. And we know that Rochester recently has been in the highest in the Northeast for rent increases. We were outpacing other cities like New York City and Boston because we have had relatively low rents. But since the pandemic, we have seen a massive increase in the number in the rent increases. Property assessments are going way up in the city of Rochester, and it's harder than ever to find a place. So people are staying for months in shelters, and we know that there's no place affordable and habitable for people to go. So rent stabilization addresses a couple of different things, which Ryan is going to talk about in a few minutes. But what we know is that housing instability affects every single part of our life. It has effects on our mental health. It has effects on our children's ability to have an education. And it has effect on crime and violence in our communities as people are desperate to get their basic needs met. So what we know is that more than half of Rochester households are rent burdened. So that means they pay 30% or more of their income on rent, and 50% of Rochester children live in poverty. So I know that the Children's Agenda put out a report that nearly 10% of all RCSD youth were homeless at some point last year. And we think that this is an underestimation, considering that sometimes that doesn't count the folks who are doubled up with family or are not reporting that they're experiencing homelessness at that time. So again, this really affects our children's ability to get an education. It affects the community safety and the stability of the city of Rochester. And it even has high impacts on mortality rates. So what we've seen is that from the Journal of Social Science and Medicine, that a 20% increase in rent yields a 16% higher mortality rate. And even simply being evicted yields a 19% higher mortality rate in general. So people who go through the eviction process are literally more likely to die because of the trauma associated with that process. So all of this is say that, like, I think anyone who kind of walks around the streets of Rochester or has spent some time here has known that we've been in a housing crisis for a long time. And some of that is due to the amount that rents continue to increase at a pace that outstrips the rise in incomes that we've seen. And even if there is a rise in income, a lot of that money ends up then being still tied up in that rent burden, where people are still paying a majority of their income on, or more than a third of their income on rent. So it's one of the highest costs that people have associated with them. So all of these reasons are why we believe that rent stabilization is a possible solution to some of these concerns. There's plenty more that has to be done, but we believe that this is one way that we can stabilize the community from all of these disastrous effects that are having to our people from their mental health, community safety, and their education. So I know that that was a lot of dense information about statistics. I'm curious if anyone has any comments or questions about what I just shared. If not, I will gladly take this sip of water.
Okay, if people have questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. John, you look like you have something. No, you're just, okay. I want to just run through that to make sure I caught some of your facts. So buildings that were built before 1974, is that what we said? And buildings that are not otherwise regulated, so that cuts out all the HUD buildings, Section 8 buildings. Is that basically all the buildings that the Rochester Housing Authority manages?
Yeah.
Yes, the public housing would not be included.
Alright.
These would buildings that are receiving some kind of additional subsidy, either through the federal government or the state government.
And it's buildings that are 6 units or more.
Correct.
So how many units are we talking about, and what share of the rental market is that? Do we know that?
Yeah, I'm really happy at this point to pass it off for a little bit more detailed information from Ryan about the solution itself.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to share a little more about what rent stabilization is and how we can bring it about. So yeah, I'll share a little bit about how the policy works, how the program works, and then what buildings are covered, and make sure we're all clear on that. So first is what it is. So basically what rent stabilization is it has 3 basic tenant protections built into it. First is rent protections. So for buildings covered, it regulates rent increases. So the way it does that is that if a municipality opts into rent stabilization, the local city council would then appoint a rent guidelines board. That rent guidelines board would be made up of tenants, landlords, and other community members. It would meet once a year, and it would say, this is the rent adjustment that we authorized this year. So it really ranges, in other parts of the state, it could be, sometimes it's a 3% rent increase, sometimes it's for 1-year leases, 4% for 2-year leases. There's been times they've done rent freezes, but basically it would meet once a year to regulate rent increases. That would be through the Rent Guidelines Board. The second major protections are eviction protections. So in all buildings that are covered, tenants would have what are called good cause eviction protections, which basically says that someone cannot just be non-renewed or where their tenancy is terminated arbitrarily without cause. So this would provide major housing stability in addition to the rent increase protections. The third major protection would be maintenance protections. So, and the way it works is basically reductions in services lead to reductions in rent. So if a landlord is saying, well, I'm not going to raise the rent, but I'm going to reduce the services. We'll say I'm taking the utilities out of the rent, or I'm not going to cover, or I'm not going to pay for certain things, or I'm not going to make certain repairs. The legal rent can be reduced, and the tenant can file with the state who regulates this for them. So those are the key protections that are built into rent stabilization, because as it is now, assuming you're in an unregulated building, a landlord could give you a 300, 400, 100% rent increase, and that would be 100% legal, right? There's nothing to protect. And unfortunately, we're seeing major, I was just talking with somebody earlier today whose buildings and their units have seen a 40% rent increase just in the last 2 years. So we're seeing in certain parts of the city, in certain buildings, certain situations, really, really rapid rent increases. And the rent is regulated not for the tenant, but for the unit. So even if someone moves, the rent is still regulated. So they can't, not to create an incentive for them to put people out, to raise the rent. So the rent stays stable for everybody. For the folks that are covered, as we're talking about, it's really a subsection, a particular universe of buildings in the city. So as already been mentioned, it's buildings with 6 or more units built before 1974. They're not already rent regulated. So the reason that public housing and some of the project-based Section 8 buildings wouldn't be is because they already have rent regulation. Basically that, if someone's paying 30% of their income towards rent, their income goes down, their rent goes down. So they already have rent increase protections. So these would be for folks that are in unregulated units. So, we support expanding rent stabilization to all tenants because we believe housing is a human right. Everybody needs housing stability. The reason there's these different 6 or more units, 1974, really it's arbitrary. This is just what's under the state law. This law was actually passed in 1974, and the years for the buildings just haven't been updated since then. So this is something we're working on, is both wanting to opt into this program, which would cover more tenants than any other program in the city of Rochester, would cover more tenants than public housing tenants, tenant-based Section 8, or any other program. And we also acknowledge that it's not enough and we want to expand it. But we do want to cover as many tenants as we can, which would be about 680 buildings, about 12,000 units, or about 25,000 people. So it would provide a major beginning to expanding housing stability in the community. And then for that. And then, so I wanted to first, any questions about what it is and how it works before I talk a little bit about how we can opt into it and what the process would be. I know people were already chatting about like what's covered and how does that work. Any further questions?
Kira, you want to unmute yourself?
Oh, hello. How you doing? Good evening, everybody. I am Kira Hudson. Nice to see Miss Liz and Lizzie and Ryan again. I just I don't know if it was mentioned before. I got in, a little bit after 5, but I know that the release of the GBI results came out. I don't know if you guys took a look at it. Now, would this be sort of parallel to that, or it would be just leaving it where it takes off? Because we know GBI is going to run out. They're just doing this little test pilot. And from that report, again, like I said, I don't know if you guys took a look at it, but they said, to your point, 60% of the income that was used for rent in that study. So when you say that we need basically to cover these housing for all these tenants, I'm pretty sure you're gonna tell about it next, but is it a good idea to again, like I said, what is the projection? Are we looking at like as soon as possible? I know we're in a housing crisis, and crisis mean right now. But again, like I said, that money is gonna run out. Like, how can we ensure that we either pick up where that is leaving out, so we won't have that gap in that deficit where it's prolong us further into the crisis, or how can we sort of gather it now so that way we can kind of tail it off. It won't look like it kind of went away, if that's a question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna talk a little more detail how we opt in, but really if we as a community really unite around this, that I believe we could have rent stabilization as early as the fall. There's a few steps. There has to be a vacancy study and a few things, but I think if we really say this is a priority and we want the city council and the mayor to move on it, because the crisis is now. We needed it yesterday.
Right.
The rents are going up at a rapid rate. In theory, we could have this by the end of the summer or the early fall.
So she threw around GDI, but some of us might not know what that's about. Is that something that should be explained?
Did you want to talk about the guaranteed basic income, Kira?
Oh, yes, no problem. So,
Mm.
also in my corporate world, I am the executive assistant to Victor's Honors Violence Prevention in the city of Rochester. So this is something we have to bring around, because it ties all in, poverty leads to the violence that's happening as well. So I'm very, this is why, like I said, I gather all my resources and galvanize. But, GBI stands for Guaranteed Basic Income. It was an initiative that Mayor Evans has, adopted prior to other cities that have been doing it, and doing a study and seeing if we give a certain pool, obviously that control pool that we can do, we can see again, where is people spending their money the most? How can we, like I said, that red lining we talked about earlier, how can we ensure that, we have the regulations for red lining, and does it make a difference for the older population versus the younger population? I believe it was about 300 people. I'm not sure, but it was a really small pool. But the results came out. I think is extended for another like next year. Like it was a 2-year thing. I'm unsure, but they just came out with the results of that. So it was just an initiative that see if we give the people more money with the cost of rising costs of like I said, rent, as well as how basic has a need, would that benefit the community, or would it be a deficit to the community? Would they still spend it on frivolous things, or would they spend it on their basic needs? And the results came out that yes, like I said, 60% they spend it on rent, and that's terrible. That's more than
I see.
one
Okay.
third of rent.
We got another question from Paul Miner, which I was just thinking of the same question. So apparently Paul's microphone's not working, so I'll ask it. So there's a lot of rental units in the city that are like individual houses, but many of them are owned by landlords who might own quite a few units. So if a landlord has more than 6 units, but they're not in a building with more than 6 units, do they come under this regulation if it should come to pass?
Yeah, so the way it works is unfortunately they don't look at the size of the landlord's portfolio. It's just they look at it building by building. So even if a landlord owns 30 units, but none of the buildings have 6 or more units, it would not be covered under rent stabilization as the law currently is now. So as I said, we would support it covering more. One of the things that we did was when the eviction moratorium expired, we did go to city council to try to pass good cause eviction protections, which would apply to every household except owner occupies, which would not be as strong as rent stabilization, but it would still protect against certain arbitrary evictions and certain rent increase evictions. So they chose not to pass it because of legal concerns. So the courts have been saying that they're saying as of now that we can't do it locally. So we are working on the state level to pass a good cause eviction bill. So there would be at least some basic tenant protections for all tenants in the state, and 4 of our 5 legislators have signed on to that as a co-sponsor, our state legislators. And then in the future, we have some working groups right now. We're working on a major update to the bill so it can get rid of these arbitrary things like 6 or more units, buildings before 1974. And we also think it's important that we opt into the program now because it's going to be harder to make those reforms if they say, well, you haven't accessed the program as it is now to protect as many people as possible. So we want to opt in, and then we want to continue to expand it and demonstrate how it benefits so many people. And then we want to get rid of some of these arbitrary limits on the state level. So it does apply to some of these other situations, because there are some landlords that own a lot of places, making a lot of money, and are not doing proper repairs.
Okay, so did you want to go on and talk more about the opt-in process? And yeah.
Sure. So in order for the city of Rochester to opt in, and basically the way it works, it's on a municipal level. So the state can't opt in, the county can't opt in, any city, town, or village in the state as of 2019 could opt in. So the city of Rochester, the town of Brighton, the town of Webster, the village of Webster, but any municipality can opt in. So right now we're working on the city of Rochester, which is where we're based, and that's where most of the tenants are in the region. So the process would be is that the municipality would have to do a vacancy survey. And basically in that survey, if they find that there's a vacancy rate of 5% or less, then they can declare, the city council could declare a housing state of emergency. This is just this process that's defined under the state law. And then if they find a vacancy rate of 5% or less and declare housing state of emergency, then the city council can opt into rent stabilization, and then they would move on to appointing a rent guidelines board. Now, this vacancy study process is very important because, as Lisa mentioned, we did get council to agree to pass legislature vacancy study in December 2019. And then eventually the administration did do the vacancy study in 2021, but it was done, from our perspective, improperly. 62% of landlords didn't respond. We had landlords that specifically said, I don't have any vacancy, so I'm not going to respond, to drive the vacancy rates up, these kind of strategic non-responses. And some of them have now said that publicly in print. And then the other issue with the original vacancy study is that there was no verification process. So I lived in a building at the time on St. Paul Street. It had 42 units. The landlord reported 11 vacancies. But if someone would have called the landlord at the time for an apartment to say, hey, do you have anything available? They would say nothing was available. So in this case, basically the landlord basically was lied about the apartments vacant and available for rent today. And that's a key piece, because as for the purposes of the vacancy study, it's supposed to be apartments that are available today. Because I think we can drive down certain neighborhoods, we can see a lot of vacant houses, some apartment buildings in really poor conditions, uninhabitable conditions are vacant. This would be habitable and available for rent today. So we so we want them to conduct a better study. Now, one of the things we have going for us, and we changed kind of the conversation locally, was we did pass a bill recently through the state legislature in June, and the governor signed December 8th, which updated the vacancy studies to create minimal standards for these studies. Because before it was kind of a free-for-all, and we put a little bit too much trust. We let the administration know the best practices. We kind of, weren't putting as much oversight and pressure on them as we needed to. And this other study happened the way it did, and they said there was a 9% vacancy rate. Even the census data now, which is not as strong of a methodology for vacancies, would say right now we have a 3.9% vacancy rate. And I think with a strict methodology, it would be even less than that. So in this new law that passed, basically what it says is that if a landlord doesn't respond to a vacancy survey, that you assume 0 vacancies. So that's another way to try to get accurate responses. So and when the city of Kingston, they did this recently where they did a vacancy study initially with a poor methodology, and they redid it. And they said, in their redo study, they said, if you don't respond, we're going to assume 0 vacancies. Well, 90%, 97% of the landlords responded. So the goal is to get a clear, accurate response with high community confidence. We don't want to keep redoing the studies. We want to do one really good study. And this is one.
Who does the study?
So it really depends. So it could be the municipality itself. So it could be done in-house by staff of the municipality, or it could be used by an outside contractor or consultant. So in the first one, the city basically modified an existing contract for a fair housing study, which is mandated by federal law, and they used a consultant from Pennsylvania. So they really had no background in vacancy studies in New York State. This is only in New York State. There's no other state that has to do this for rent stabilization. So it's a really specific process. So, we've recommended to the city, and, we've met with most of city council about this, and they've said that that if they do it, and I'll give you some updates where the process is at, that they would want us to recommend. So we have a consultant that's been working in the Hudson Valley, done a lot of the recent studies, follows a more proper methodology. So we think probably if the city uses a consultant that has a lot of experience, we're more likely to get a proper methodology and accurate results.
And does the city have a list of all the landlords that should be surveyed in this?
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's not a lengthy process to find
No.
out.
No,
Okay.
and the fact that they already did it in 2019, they have a list of those 680 buildings. So they could easily send it to the consultant. And that's what I'm saying is if we wanted to, we could get to work quickly and move this process forward pretty quickly. Just to talk about the timeline a little bit, and then I see your question, Kiara. I'll answer that as well. As far as the timeline, so based on the last discussions we had with the council president, Miguel Melendez, and we're going to meet with him again on Thursday. Basically what he said was that he wants the city to redo the study, and that there are the votes to redo it on council, and that he just wants, he says, the state to fund it. So that's probably not necessary. The city has the money, but basically, based on negotiations we've had with them and the state legislature, there's people might have been following, but through some of the news, that there's supposed to be $25 million coming down in the state budget of anti-poverty funds for the city of Rochester. So there's kind of an agreement, a verbal agreement with council president and other council members that that money can be used for the vacancy study. The first one was $40,000. So for city budget purposes, it's really a drop in the bucket, even if this one's 60, 70. This is not, the city agreed to pay for part of a feasibility study for converting the public utility system for $500,000. This is really a drop in the bucket. But regardless of how it's funded, assuming the money comes down in the budget and the budget's passed on time, which it might not be. Recently, it's been late the last few years. The state budget's due March 31st. Was passed on time. Basically, have a commitment that they could pass vacancy study legislation in April. Maybe if the budget's delayed, do it in March, do it in May, and they would do a reimbursement from that process. So this is when I'm saying this is the timeline could be quick. That's what I mean, is that it really could move fast, but I think they're going to have to see a lot of community support, because there's always, wealthy interests that don't want to change the status quo. So the more people are engaged from the community, and saying, we really need housing stability. And this is one policy that we can do on a local level that could have a high impact and cost very little money, because the city doesn't have to keep funding it every year. You pay small stipends for the RentStabilization board that meets 2 or 3 days a year, but really there's all the regulation enforcement is for the state. So it's a really high impact policy, which almost has no cost. So it's really a win-win from a city level.
So it's a two-step process. First to authorize the rent study, and then
Yes.
the results are back to opt in. And then do they have to redo this rent study periodically, or?
So they don't. You have to do it at least once and show that you're eligible at least once. And most municipalities, they just do the study once. They don't redo it. But they can. So anytime they want to, the council could authorize to do another study to show you're still eligible or not eligible, but you really only have to do it once. Now, New York City, they do it every 3 or 4 years. They've got this massive study that covers many other things. And the Census Bureau, they contract with the Census Bureau to do it. But it's really because they're collecting data on so many things, and vacancy is just one of them. But most municipalities, they do it once, and it's kind of a one and done thing. And then what people find is that the policy, once people have it, it's immensely popular. So it's very rare that a municipality opts into rent stabilization and then opts out, because people can see the benefits. People can see the differences. These are the buildings that's regulated. This is the stability of the families in those buildings. These are the buildings that are unregulated. And this is the instability, the differences in the rents in an unregulated market versus a regulated market.
So usually whenever people want rent control, somebody says, oh, but then landlords won't build new units and there won't be any investment, and what we
Right.
actually need is more housing.
Mhm.
So talk to me about that.
So as far as, you know, the idea that this will stop the new development, as we talked about, these buildings would only, the current policy would only apply to buildings built before 1974. So it would not apply to any new construction. We can debate whether it should, but this policy would not. So
Mhm.
so it's not gonna apply to any new construction. So we don't see it preventing the increasing supply of housing. Now we have some policies we're working on, we think, that could increase the supply of housing and make it affordable, but this policy will not affect the supply of housing from our perspective, for the simple reason that it's just not going to apply to new construction. And then as far as the conditions, I think the two for the investing in current buildings, I think the two key parts I'd want to think about is, one is rent stabilization does not deny a landlord's ability to make a profit. It just denies unlimited rent increases. And actually it's the opposite. The law protects landlords' right to make a fair return on the investment. So there's 4 ways landlords can raise rents legally under rent stabilization. So under increases from the Rent Guidelines Board, that it might be authorized through a process called individual apartment improvements. There's a process where you can submit concrete improvements and the state authorizes certain rent increases, but it's not arbitrary to say, well, I put new paint on the wall, so I'm going to do a 20% rent increase. It would be a concrete change with, a rent increase that's more reasonable. And then there's another process called major capital improvements, which would be like building-wide improvements, like putting in a new boiler or a new heating system or something like that. And that's regulated through the state as well. And the third process is something called a hardship petition. So if a landlord is genuinely in hardship and they can prove that they're in hardship and that they would need to raise the rent further in order to guarantee a return on their investment, the state can do that as well. So the law is not designed to bankrupt landlords or to get them to not make repairs. It's to provide basic housing stability. And we feel like it is balanced. We do have 50 years of history with this particular law, the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, which the rent stabilization is on. So we can look at in so many places. And not just New York City, there's 41 municipalities in New York State that have already opted into rent stabilization. So these are massive metropolises like New York City, mid-sized cities like Rochester, like Yonkers, and everywhere to very small villages. There's villages of 2,000 people that have opted in. So it's really every level of size of village, town, or city have opted in the last few years. And people have seen the benefits and not seen disinvestment from landlords. And the other piece that I mentioned before is the maintenance protection. So if the landlord does try to decrease conditions, repairs, that the tenants can file for a legal reduction in rent. So that's another disincentive to just totally, disinvest from the building. Now, I don't think it's going to prevent some of the poor conditions that exist. So this is where we would also continue to fight to enhance code enforcement. But the policy itself, we don't see it creating disinvestment. Does that answer
So
your question?
yeah, it's really helpful. So the enforcement's coming from the state? Is that what you're
Yes.
telling me? So
Mhm.
if you are mad because now your landlord says, I'm not gonna clear the sidewalks anymore, that's up to tenants, then some state agency is who you're gonna complain to and they're gonna get
So yes,
involved?
so the New York State Division of Homes and Community Renewal, they handle all of the, if there's allegations of a rent overcharge, reduction in services, there's a whole process to file paperwork with them, and then they can look at if there's a rent overcharge or or a legal reduction in services, and they can order changes to the legal rent.
Well, I had no idea such an agency existed at the state level, so I'm learning here. I was fascinated when Liz said at the beginning that Arundecoit had opted in to the first version and like even stayed in after Rochester was out. Can you tell us what other local city or towns were covered or you think might be naturals to get in?
You talking about in the past or going forward?
Well, either way. I mean,
I mean, in the past, there were times where pretty much all of Monroe County was covered,
really.
and Parrington was covered, almost all of the outskirts. I don't know the timelines when the different ones opted out. Other than the ones we talked about, the three inner ring suburbs that stayed until 1973. But there was a time where almost every municipality was covered. And I could see that if the city opted in, that to expanding, starting with really any municipality, but definitely the inner ring suburbs, which I think some people are surprised when they hear how many rental units are in some of the suburbs. Last time I looked, I think Brighton was about 43% of their residents were tenants. Arundecoit, it's somewhere between 35-40%. Greece is about 30 to 35%. So in some of the Henrietta has a large proportion. So not all of them have high rises, but if you think about some parts of the suburbs, there are some of these really large apartment complexes, low rises that are 2 stories and townhomes type ones, and there's usually some in almost every suburb, and then some of them have a lot. So if the city of Rochester were to opt in, I could see the possibility of Brighton, Arundecoit, other suburban municipalities, and the rents are going up very high in the suburbs. I mean, it's really bad in the city, but the rents in the suburbs um are very, very high. So, this is something that ideally, we could, if we were successful in the city, take a regional approach, because really everybody's got to have affordable places to live.
Right.
I think Kia,
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, if the state is regulating, any complaints or, like I said, abuse of it, is
Right.
there anything on the local level that can walk? Cause my fear is tenants don't know, like, there's too much paperwork, they don't know who to talk to. Are you guys available to walk them through the process? Is there something that needs to be implemented so, we all can get involved in helping a tenant walk through that process as well? How do that would go?
Yeah. I mean, as of now, just because we've been advocating and being educated and advocating for rent control in different ways for the last 7 years, our organization is the most knowledgeable about the current process. So we would definitely work with folks, but if we were to opt in, we'd really want to do a deep community education process, all the legal services providers, the housing council, service agencies that are working with um, social workers, working with folks on a daily basis. So we would definitely want to help take the lead on that. And we would really want to do a deep community education process because it would be new for Rochester. And so we'd want to do, have a lot of handouts, have a lot of information, make it as least intimidating as possible. and we'd really want to do just really bring a lot of organizations in, so everybody knows their rights, how to enforce them, and I think it'll be, be daunting, but it'll be really an exciting process to say, hey, we can do something that's measurable with a deep impact and make a huge difference. Because sometimes, certain policies we pass, it's tough to know what the exact impact is. But I think about in 2019, when we helped pass the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, part of that was these tenant protections gave some greater notice for evictions and built in a few more protections. And in many ways, these were more minor protections than rent stabilization. But even within 1 year, what we found was a 26% reduction in evictions in Rochester City Court. So even us passing that policy, we saw an immediate impact, families staying in their homes, reducing evictions. And so that's the exciting part. It'll be a little daunting to do the community education, but this is something I hope we can do deep collaboration across the community to do this education, because I think we're going to see a big impact.
So do you have some figures on evictions recently? I've been hearing some terrible numbers, but I don't have them on the top of my head. There's a lot of people getting evicted.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I am just sharing in the chat the link to the petition that you guys have put together. So you're looking for individuals to sign this petition. There's also a letter of support that can come from organizations. The league will certainly take a look at that and see whether we can sign that. If there's any other organizations represented here, I'm sure you can be in touch with, is it on your website somewhere, the letter of support? Where can people go to find that?
So it's not currently on our website, but we are hoping to build out a rent stabilization page very soon. But Barbara, I will definitely send it directly to you to get out to.
Right, I just figured some of these other listeners might have organizations that also might be interested. And I'll be happy to share it with anyone who, once I get it. All right. Do we have other questions or comments? I must say, I mean, I can't hear I'm speaking as an individual, but this seems incredibly sane to me. Like, I do understand. I mean, I have a PhD in economics, so I know where people get upset about price controls, but this really seems like a completely reasonable compromise between, you know, wild cowboy capitalism, letting everybody get the last dollar out of everything and
Yeah.
let people live lives. So, I mean, there's so much to think about here. I'm thinking about the fact that in 1974 is when they passed this bill and they had it cover buildings built before 1974. So they were probably worried about disincentivizing investment at that point. So if you can get the state to revise the law, you know, maybe they'll set it for 2024 because all those buildings are already built and why shouldn't we get them regulated? I would love to see those single unit houses get regulated. That we have so many of them in Rochester and they're on the whole in terrible condition and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, our statewide coalition, the Housing Justice for All, is looking to expand the ETPA. But I think even further than that, they're looking to bring a social housing development authority that could take properties out of private market control and steward them as permanently affordable and community controlled. So we think that rent stabilization this way is a first step into that process of continuing to make our land and housing controlled by the people who live in it. And we think this is one way that the state is allowing us to, but we're excited to get together with groups to keep passing that larger vision that makes housing as a human right for everyone.
Right. I mean, I'm just thinking of all the houses that have been torn down in Rochester because nobody took care of them. I mean, that's just crazy that yes, okay, you can't do everything, but this is like a really good place to start is my personal impression. Okay, so you'll note there, Richard Cotting put a note that the TIAR might be interested in signing, so please send him a copy of the organizational sign-on as well. All right. Anything else we need to discuss here? I see some beautiful faces here who haven't chimed in, and I would love to hear what you're thinking. Nobody wants to speak. All
Hey,
right.
Brian, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure I'm clear. So sign a petition and the next step from the petition is what?
They want organizations to sign on the letter that they have drafted that also supports it. So instead of Barbara Grosh signing an individual letter, I would sign on behalf of the League of Women Voters, for an example. So any other organizations that you know of that might be willing to take a stand.
And then
Yeah.
oh, keep
But
going.
so sharing that link on social media with your friends to say, I signed this petition and you should too. Does it make a difference to this step? I mean, a lot of people on here might not actually be city residents. Some of us aren't. So the support from anywhere is relevant. Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing is, we're speaking to council. So if people wanna speak to city council in March, then, and just, say they're in support of doing rent, city signing on to do a vacancy study. That's another way people can help out. And Lisa, you you do outreach. If people you wanna, go ahead.
So do you have a date that you want to share to encourage people to go, a date and a time?
Yeah, so I'm gonna drop a link in the chat, and I'll also make sure this goes in the email to you, Barbara and Rich, that we are doing, we have a how to plug in to the tenant union's rent stabilization document that updates regularly with our upcoming events, our committees, and our outreach. So I will drop that in there.
Okay, so I'll also pass these. So this has been recorded tonight and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. And when it is, I will send a link to everyone who registered, which is actually quite a lot more people than are here right now. So I'll include those links and suggestions for action.
Thank you, Barb.
Okay. All right, well, if we're done here, we might as well take off. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I think this is really exciting work that you're doing, and when I first heard you speak a couple of weeks ago, I was totally floored because I had no idea this was going on. So we want to help you get the word out.
Well, thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.